Hi, I'm David Singleton, partner and co-founder of LTFluency.com, along with Paul May. Welcome. Matthew 18:18 is still the focus of the study here, and this is part 2. Versions of the New Testament tend to put the verse in the context of verses 15 through 20. As presented in the Mirror of Heavenly Values Part 1 video, the verse is best understood as a standalone verse, and a grammatical look into the structure of the verse will strengthen that view and open up a new vista about its teaching. Verse 18 is here. An interlinear literal rendering of this verse is given here. Truly I say to you, whenever you fasten on the earth, it will be, having been fastened in heaven. And whenever you loosen on the earth, it will be, having been loosened in heaven. The remarks that follow delve into the idea of the verse as represented by the grammar and semantics of the saying in both English and Greek. Some people might not care too much for this kind of analysis if the result of the analysis yields the relative same meaning in the end as they knew in the first place. But the underlying grammar becomes tremendously important if it changes how a verse is translated, and subsequently how a verse could hold true in the rest of the New Testament. The three colored portions you see represent the three parts of the verse's structure carrying the meaning of this verse. One can see a repetition of these structures, the first part applying to fasten, the second applying to loosen. The part in red highlights two words taken together and translated whenever. The part in blue spotlights two verbs using the idea of subjunctive in Greek. The part in green brings out the meaning of the combination of an indicative future tense verb with a perfect passive participle. The modern versions that have come to us translate hosa, the first word highlighted in red, as whatever, a relative pronoun used to introduce a noun clause as a direct object, as in whatever you bind or forbid. These translations have relied on older translations, like the King James Version of 1611, the Geneva Bible of 1599, and Tyndale's version of 1534, the first version of the New Testament in English, all translating hosa as whatsoever. This rendering comes to the modern reader in an unbroken tradition in major translations, from the New Testament in English to the present day. To translate this idea differently, then, will require close scrutiny of how the three components of this sentence work together semantically. Hosa is used in Greek for the notion of a general quantity of something that isn't exactly defined. The idea in English functions as an adjective to describe or modify a noun by asking how many of something. And it functions as an adverb to describe or modify a verb by asking how much and to what extent. By way of example, our house needed some improvements shows some telling how many improvements. An adverb example is shown in the following sentence. We sometimes need help, showing to what extent we need help. Hosa had no adverbial form, so the Greeks used it for both adjectival and adverbial ideas in a sentence. The second word, ion, is positioned in the sentence to have double influence. Influence over the word before it and over the verb following it. In other words, it creates two triggers. The first trigger is that the verb following ion needs to be in the subjunctive mode. The translation of the subjunctive mode for verbs shows the conditional nature of the clause and indicates the action hasn't really taken place. Ion translates to if in English and has the same semantics in English and Greek, a hypothetical action that didn't happen. Use of the English words should, could, would, may, might, were, as in if you were, are examples of the ideas expressed in the clauses of the subjunctive mode. The second trigger is that ion holds influence over the word hosa, making it an adverb showing a measure of how much or to what extent. This measure is related to the two verbs, desite and lucite, to show its conditional nature for an unspecified amount of time. So it could not refer to the relative pronoun whatever. In addition, the two separate influenced words by eon, hosa, and desete, should not be translated independently of each other, as in however much time for hosa you should bind, subjunctive of bind, because it doesn't make ready sense. A person needs to use an English idea that combines the conditional nature of the verb with the element of an unspecified amount of time. Whenever is a good word choice for this combination because it shows that something will happen when conditions are met. This translation would be whenever you bind or loosen. Whatever is not a possibility because it is related to a noun rather than a verb. The last point in green is the use of the future tense of the verb be, will be, estai, which is not in subjunctive mode, but indicative, because it is used in a clause outside of the conditional clause. Will be, estai, is followed by the perfect passive participle, delimina, lelumina, binding and loosening. An example of an English sentence that literally renders the combination of the two grammatical elements, future tense plus perfect passive participle, is, we will be having been seen by a doctor at this time next year if we move to New York City by summer. The formation of will be and having been seen doesn't occur in modern English. Also notice that the English word already is implied, but could be explicitly inserted after doctor if the speaker wanted to do so. Using the familiar binding and loosening, the literal translation of the two verbs is rendered will be having been bound already and will be having been loosened already. The last stage in translation of this verse is to put the Greek phrase of future tense plus perfect passive participle into modern English for the idea of bind and loosen. While forbid and permit are terms used by modern translations and are easily understood by modern readers, they are words that conjure laws or rules being established for all time to come. Perhaps two terms that relate hosa to the idea of a more transient nature of time to show that issues come and go through much shorter increments like a century or half a century are require and free up. A quick illustration is John's statement about not eating meat in Revelation 2 verses 20 through 23 near the end of the first century, and Paul's statement 50 years earlier on the same subject in 1 Corinthians 8 verses 1 through 13. The two references show a difference in an audience's values, geography, and time period. Paul and John would require or free up whether to eat meat or not based on God's leading of their witness for Jesus. The translation of Matthew 18:18 has New Testament application then for the reading, "It's the truth when I tell you, whenever you require something on the earth, it will already have been required in heaven. And when you free something up on the earth, it will already have been freed up in heaven." Most importantly, for the rendition of this verse, however, is the frame of reference to Jesus' words themselves in the Lord's Prayer. Our Father in heaven, your name has been honored. Your reign has come. Your will has been done, as in heaven, now on earth. This idea is also perfectly illustrated in Acts 10 verses 9 through 16, when Peter encounters a sheet being let down from heaven with both clean and unclean animals in it. Peter hears a voice saying to kill and eat, but he declines because the instruction was counter to what the Jews understood as a requirement of God. However, after each of the appearances of the sheet, Peter hears the voice saying, "What God has called clean, you should not refer to as unclean." After the vision, Peter speaks to Cornelius, saying he learned from God that Gentiles are no longer considered unclean. Peter had to also demystify the incident with the Jerusalem Jews, since they balked at unclean Gentiles being offered the message of Christ. This would be a case of close proximity in time to the application of the second part of Matthew 18:18, Whenever you free something up on the earth, it will already have been freed up in heaven. The question to us today as Christians is how we relate the verse to our personal walk with God. Jesus spoke the words in verse 18 to his disciples as they were having an in-house teaching session, if we think the context of the first part of chapter 18 applies to the same. If that context limits the saying to the apostles, we don't have to personally apply the verse, since God worked with the apostles after Jesus' ascension to put faith in Christ on the right road. But if we drop the restriction that the saying only applied to the apostles, then perhaps Paul's view of maturity as a Christian is a model for applying the verse. Paul wrote to the Christians at Corinth, "When I was a child, I spoke, thought, and understood things like a child. But now that I have matured, I have outgrown my childish understanding." 1 Corinthians 13, verse 11. God leads us to realize his ways in entirely new environments as we mature. We just have to be open to those new horizons when heaven requires it of us or frees us up. Our faith and experience of God grow as we ourselves leave our parents, raise children, mature in our jobs, and go through the empty nest. And those realizations continue because we encounter new environments as we see our own children age, welcome grandchildren, lose spouses, and notice the world has changed from our former experiences of life.